Hey everybody, it's Rabbit, and today we're going to be seeing one of my favorite tanks, the M4 Sherman. I really like this family of tanks, and throughout this video we're kind of going to see why and show some of the positive features of it all that you can really take advantage of in your games. One of the first things I kind of want to go over is the armor profiles of M4 Shermans. Now, the first vehicle we're going to look at is the M4A1, and the M4A1 has pretty decent armor for a 3.3 tank. The problem with the M4A1 is that you can't really angle it because of these sections here. Because if you angle it, the rounded section will mean that the part closest to your enemy is always flat, and thus they can shoot it for a relatively easy pen and get a shell into your crew compartment, which usually means a kill if they're using APHE. There are situations in which you can angle it, and we'll look at that later in the video, but that is one of the major drawbacks of the A1 and why it's one of the lowest BR Shermans. The next Sherman design we're going to look at is the M4. Now, the M4 does have sharp edges, so you can angle it pretty efficiently. The only drawback to the base M4 armor pattern is that you do have these bulges on the front for both the driver and the assistant driver that are kind of weak points and do allow the enemy easier pens than normal, although they're not as bad as the M4A1. The best armor, however, is on essentially the M4A2 and the M4A3s, which you'll start seeing around 4.0. This armor, as you can see, has no major frontal weak points. The machine gun is kind of a frontal weak point, but it's not that much weaker than the rest of the armor. And this, combined with the sharp edges, means you can also angle it effectively, increasing the frontal thickness, making this actually pretty well armored, and it can be difficult for some opponents to get through, and we'll see that throughout this video. Now, one thing we do want to note is that this armor profile does occur on a much lower BR tank, the M4A3-105, and at 2.7 it is an incredibly good armor profile and is probably one of the reasons a lot of people think the M4A3-105 is busted. The M4A3-105 does have a noticeably harder gun to use than some of the other Shermans, and that's the reason why it's at such a low BR, because its gun is low velocity. The heat rounds aren't necessarily the most damaging, it has a slow turret traverse, and it has a slow reload. But the armor is good enough that it does make up for that pretty often. Throughout this video, you're probably going to notice that every time it looks like I'm going to take fire, I immediately turn the tank off to one side slightly. And of course, that's because I want to try to get that angled benefit, and if the opponent is trying to scope in a weak point, I want to make it harder for them to scope in that weak point. I also don't generally stop when the enemy's aiming directly at me, which is another big thing to know about using this armor, because obviously if you stop, the enemy can just take careful aim, shoot whatever they want, even if you are well angled. One of my favorite features of the Sherman family, with obvious exceptions such as the A3-105, is the gun. Now, while the gun on both the 75 and 76 Shermans are not exactly the best in the world, one thing they do have going for them is that Shermans generally have at least half-decent turret traverses, at least compared to a lot of the enemies they fight, so they can spin the gun fairly easily, especially combined with a responsive hull traverse, so you can get the gun on target without a whole lot of effort. And then they also have a short stabilizer, so the gun will be very stable at low speeds, and even when you're stopping to take a shot, you will get your gun on target much faster. Combined with the fact that Shermans generally have at least enough penetration to deal with most targets they fight, even though they won't necessarily be able to just click on anywhere, and the Sherman gun is just very responsive and very easy to use. On top of that, Shermans generally have a pretty good ammo selection. Almost all Shermans will have an armor-piercing high explosive round, which of course does good internal damage and has good enough penetration. They will also generally have a smoke round, and sometimes even have an APCR round if you need some extra pen, although APCR's damage is quite poor, so it's more of a desperation round. Now, one thing to look at in regards to the Shermans is the use of both vertical and horizontal cover. Shermans are pretty good at using both types of cover, but they use them slightly differently. Vertical cover is any type of solid object that you can hide the tank behind. This is something like, say, the wall of a building or a giant rock in this case. What a vertical cover does is it allows you to completely conceal your tank until you want to go out and engage. Horizontal cover does the same thing, but they have different advantages and disadvantages. Vertical cover, the big advantage is that you can do what's called angling and come out of it. This way, the side that is facing the cover, the side of your tank facing the cover, is not going to be visible to the enemy. And of course, the side facing away is concealed by your tank, so that's not facing either. So this is the way you can gain the benefit of angling without showing either of your sides. And as we discussed with the M4A1, this is actually the scenario in which the M4A1 can angle effectively, because that rounded side is not visible to the other player. The big drawback to vertical cover, however, is that you can only really appear from one spot. It's not like you could appear 20 feet in the air or something. So if you have a piece of vertical cover between you and your opponent, they kind of know where to pre-aim. So vertical cover benefits you the most if you have frontal armor that actually can stop an enemy round, especially while angled. Now you'll notice when I'm using vertical cover, I'm not just driving straight out. What I'm actually doing is I'm kind of driving a little bit out, stopping and backing up. This sort of stuttering keeps the opponent from being able to accurately range in on a good part of the tank and may cause them to fire early and miss their shots. The problem with vertical cover, and one of the really big ones, is that if you don't have a lot of armor, it can often be very difficult to peek around vertical cover without the enemy getting the shot off first and destroying you. In this respect, unlike what you're seeing with the Sherman, where I know I have good enough armor that I can kind of try to bait shots, what you want to do when you have no armor is you want to back up a little, get as much of a run as possible, and round the corner as quickly as possible to try and rush the other person into bad shots, or just surprise them and get your shot off first. Lightly armored vehicles just do not use this type of cover anywhere near as effectively as heavily armored ones. Here we're going to show some gameplay from a different game in which I'm using horizontal cover. Horizontal cover is something like a hill or maybe the top of like a large structure. The advantage to horizontal cover is that you can use the third-person camera to peek over it without being visible to the enemy at all. Additionally, the advantage to horizontal cover as opposed to vertical cover is that horizontal cover you can appear from anywhere along the horizontal cover, so your opponent doesn't just have one place to look at, they have to kind of manually spot which part of the cover you are coming from. This can be very useful, especially if you have a very light and mobile vehicle, because you can move from different parts of the cover to different parts of the cover. Another big advantage is that many tanks have significantly better traverse, that is side-to-side movement, than they have elevation. So even if the enemy spots you, they may not be able to get their gun up fast enough. Additionally, with horizontal cover, you only really have to expose your turret and your gun. This means if you have good gun depression and good turret armor, it's going to be very difficult to deal with you. You also present a smaller target. On top of that, generally a lot of tanks, especially around the World War II battle ratings, have at least 2 crew members in the hull, which means even a good hit to the turret, unless it gets something like ammo, often can't take out the entire crew. The Sherman is a pretty capable chassis for using horizontal cover because it has a short stabilizer, and in addition it also has a pretty good gun depression. And its mobility in terms of responsiveness is actually pretty decent, even though it's not the fastest vehicle in the world. So this is one of the advantages of Shermans in general, especially when you start talking the Shermans with fewer frontal weak points. Regardless of what type of cover is available on the map, the Shermans often have a way to take advantage of it, which artificially buffs their armor to an extent. Much like the armor and firepower, the mobility aspect of Shermans is another point where it's acceptable and often as good as it needs to be, even if it isn't the best. The Sherman can accelerate both backwards and forwards relatively quickly and also spin on the spot relatively quickly, so even though you're not exactly going to be winning any races, the Sherman often can do what it needs to do and get where it needs to go, and really that's kind of what matters. To go into some closing thoughts on the Sherman, it's one of those tanks where it doesn't have any one overwhelming advantage. If anything, the most remarkable part about the Sherman is how unremarkable it is. The mobility isn't anything so crazy that you'll be able to race to the top spots or to run circles around your opponent. The armor isn't so good that you will passively get a benefit from it without trying to use it. And the gun is not just a click on the enemy anywhere and expect to get a kill sort of weapon. This puts the Sherman in kind of an interesting position where I'm pretty sure a lot of newer players are probably not going to get the most out of it, because the Sherman, to put it in the simplest form possible, it does anything you need it to do, but it doesn't do anything for you. It's not going to carry you unless you already know what you're doing. And this is probably the reason why, as I have gone better and better with the game, as I've gone through more tech trees and then I go back to Shermans, I think I tend to like the Shermans a lot more because of that feature. I don't need it to do anything for me, I just need it to do what I want it to do. And the Sherman is an excellent class at doing that. It's probably one of my favorite tanks in the game, even though as you start going up in BR to some of the 76mm arm Shermans, you do start losing some of the advantages, especially in the realm of armor. Overall, if you are a newer player and you maybe gone through the Shermans and weren't that impressed by them, I would highly recommend, especially start getting more skills, more map knowledge, and more knowledge of enemy vehicles, going back and replaying them, because I really think the vehicles are definitely worth your time, even if they might not have seemed like it while you didn't have that much experience. And that's the video for us for today. Hope you enjoyed it. Hope you had fun. Like, comment, and subscribe if you did. And have a great day, everybody.